Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pedro Vargas David. I'm the chairman of Euronews, and I'm going to be moderating today's session on empowering inclusive growth through innovative financing. We will start our session with two keynote speeches, followed then by our debate with our four guests. And to get us rolling, we will start with the intervention from the China Exim Bank's chairman. Mr. Chen is chairman and executive director of the Export-Import Bank of China. Prior to this role, he served as vice president of the Bank of China and as vice governor of the People's Government of the Hainan province. Mr. Huaiyan Chen, please, the floor is yours.
Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It gives me great pleasure to be here with all of you in Beijing on the occasion of AIIB 10th Annual Meeting of the Board of Governors, engaging in in-depth discussion on the theme of empowering inclusive growth through innovative financing. I wish to extend, on behalf of China Exim Bank, congratulations on remarkable achievements of AIIB over the last decade, and a warm welcome to all of you. Long-term, stable, sustainable financing lies at the core of achieving inclusive growth. Today, the international landscape is marked by instability and complexity, with unilateralism and protectionism on the rise, severely impacting the world economy, global markets, and international trade order. Developing countries need to mobilize more capital to address internal and external challenges. At the same time, reduced willingness among some developed nations to provide development finance has exacerbated funding shortages. This necessitates enhanced finance innovation to mobilize more capital and improve financial accessibility so as to advance sustainable development goals. In response to these challenges, President Xi Jinping has put forward the Belt and Road Initiative and the Global Development Initiative, offering China solution and wisdom to address global development bottlenecks and provide a community with a shared future for mankind. These initiatives have gained wide recognition and support. In implementing these initiatives, Chinese financial institutions have innovated financing products and models, expanded diversified funding channels, and worked with global partners to bridge the global development financing gap. Through tangible project implementations, we share China's development experience with our partners, facilitate knowledge and technology transfer, and assist developing countries in their deeper participation in international trade and economic cooperation, thus advancing inclusive economic globalization. China Exim Bank, as a financial institution dedicated to supporting China's foreign trade, we have business spanning over 160 countries and regions. We leverage our expertise in overseas project financing, special financing, and equity investment to support infrastructure connectivity and at the same time prioritize job creation and income growth through industrial development. We'll continue to support industrial classes such as China-Indonesia, two countries' twin parks, and China-Egypt, Jeddah-Suez Economic and Trade Cooperation Zone, enhancing local economic resilience and providing international trade cooperation. We adapt to the evolving needs in development finance by improving our multi-tiered, whole chain and integrated financing services. We explore mechanisms where policy-based finance drives commercial capital, official funds mobilize private capital, and large projects catalyze small-scale programs to attract diverse funding sources. We promote local currency use in trade and investment, optimize cross-border RMB financial services, and have assisted Hungary and African Export-Import Bank in issuing panda bonds, reducing their financing costs, exchange rate risks. We value exchange and cooperation with international financing institutions, pooling resources through co-financing. on lending, and third-party market cooperation. AIB, as a new type of multilateral development bank international cooperation platform, has established itself as a leading force in infrastructure and sustainable development financing through its advanced development philosophy, efficient governance, innovative business models, and flexible financing instruments. China Exim Bank share strong alignment with AIB in terms of visions and areas we support. We have achieved collaboration in green on-lending, syndicated loans, knowledge sharing, personnel exchange. Looking ahead, we'll see greater synergy and innovation cooperation models in credit, equity, investments, and guarantees so as to contribute more to global inclusive growth and sustainable development. Distinguished guests present here today represent governments, multilateral institutions, financial institutions, and private sector, bringing rich practical experiences in finance innovation. I look forward to your insights and proposals on how financing innovation can advance inclusive growth, and we work together to craft solutions for a more inclusive global development landscape.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chen. We am now very proud to introduce Vice Chairman Zhao. Fengtao Zhao has served as Vice Chairman of the China International Development Cooperation Agency since 2022. He is a member of the CPC leadership group of CIDCA. Previously, he has held a number of positions of leadership in the National Government Offices Administration. Sir, you have the floor.
Distinguished Mr. Chen Huaiyu, Chairman of Import Bank of China, esteemed Mr. Ahmed Galal, member of the AIIB International Advisory Panel, former Minister of Finance of Egypt, respected Mr. Zheng Jue, Acting Vice President for Policy and Strategy of AIIB, Mr. Miao Yanliang, Chief Strategist of China International Capital Corporation, Honorable Ms. Amakobi Sande, UNICEF representative to China, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. So it is a great honor to be invited to the seminar this afternoon. We know that the world is undergoing transformative changes unseen in a century, with the global development agenda facing unprecedented challenges. The United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, serving as humanity's shared blueprint for progress, has fallen significantly short of expectations. Only approximately 17% of the targets are on track to be achieved. However, financing needs to achieve the SDGs have continued to rise, now reaching about $4.2 trillion. While development resources are shrinking amid multiple global crises, this growing scissors effect, where need increase as resources decrease, is severely impeding global inclusive growth. Strengthening solidarity and cooperation, while scaling up development financing has become both an urgent necessity and a fundamental guarantee for advancing the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Facing challenges, China has consistently been a steadfast actor and a proactive contributor to global development. We firmly believe that lasting global prosperity cannot be achieved without the collective development of the developing countries. To this end, China has implemented a series of pragmatic measures to help bridge the global development deficit and advance inclusive growth. First, initiative-driven efforts to build development consensus. China has prioritized financial connectivity as one of the 5 connectivities in high-quality Belt and Road cooperation, and incorporating financing for development as a priority area under the Global Development Initiative. So these initiatives aim to recenter development issues on the global agenda and provide Chinese solutions and public goods to address global financing challenges. Second, platform building to enhance policy alignment. China has successfully hosted major forums such as the Belt and Road Forum for International Cooperation, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation (FORCAC), the Forum on Global Action for Shared Development, and the China-Indian Ocean Region Forum on Blue Economy Development Cooperation, effectively facilitating in-depth alignment among participating parties on development policies, financing needs, and project collaboration. Simultaneously, we have actively advanced and participated in the development of multilateral financing institutions, organizations such as the AIIB and the NDB of BRICS have emerged as pivotal forces in supporting regional and global development. Meanwhile, financing cooperation platforms such as the Silk Road Fund and China-Africa Development Fund have strategically focused on critical sectors, leveraging multiple stakeholder resources to bolster economic growth and livelihood improvements in developing countries. Certainly, China has taken concrete actions to support the financing needs of developing countries. We have announced and delivered a series of major development financing measures, actively participated in and advanced the G20 Debt Service Suspension Initiative, DSSI, and established a global development project pool and a capital pool in collaboration with China Development Bank, the Exim Bank of China, the Bank of China, and AIIB. We have mobilized a special fund for GDI with a total of 14 billion US dollars. The Global Development and South-South Cooperation Fund has expanded to 4 billion US dollars. So we have actively innovated financing models, including hybrid financing cooperation with the AIIB under the Special Fund framework, which successfully advanced the Obergam-Norobold Road project. Long bridge and approaches in Tajikistan, we have exported debt for development swap with Egypt to alleviate its debt pressure and transform it into development momentum. Additionally, we support eligible countries in issuing panda bonds to provide more sustainable and tailored financing solutions for developing countries. Dear friends, looking ahead, promoting financing innovation and empowering inclusive growth requires the joint efforts of the international community. In this regard, I would like to propose 3 recommendations. First, we should scale up development resource commitment. Development holds the master key to solving all problems. Developed countries should honor their commitments by delivering the official development assistance target of 0.7% of gross national income (GNI) in full and on schedule. The international community should vigorously advance the reform of international financial architecture, making the governance structures of major multilateral finance institutions more equitable and reasonable, while enhancing the representation and voice of developing countries. China will, as always, contribute within its capacity and continue to increase its resource input into global development cooperation. We look forward to more consensus and outcomes at the upcoming 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, AFD4, later this month. Secondly, we should deepen financing partnership. We advocate for a strengthened policy dialogue and strategic coordination among governments, international, multilateral, and development banks, the private sector, philanthropic institutions, and other stakeholders. By enhancing South-South cooperation, promoting North-South collaboration, and expanding triangular cooperation, we can break down financing barriers and foster a partnership model characterized by complementary strengths, shared risks, and multiple benefits. Thirdly, we should innovate financing cooperation models. To bridge financing gaps, innovation is the key. All parties should focus on critical sustainable development areas such as green transition and digital transformation, and vigorously advance the application of blended financing mechanisms. By maximizing the leadership and the catalytic role of public funds, we can effectively leverage greater private capital participation. Concurrently, we should actively explore in a scale-up synergistic aid loan investment cooperation model to diversify finance instruments, enhance fund utilization efficiency. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, financing innovation serves as the engine. Inclusive growth, the direction, and sustainable development, the ultimate goal. Facing pressing challenges and daunting tasks, let us embrace the shared vision of implementing the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We need to move beyond zero-sum mentality and deepen practical cooperation. China stands ready to work with the international community to advance finance innovation cooperation, empower inclusive growth, and inject a stronger and more enduring momentum into building a universally inclusive, mutually beneficial, and collectively prosperous world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will now explore today's topic in greater depth. From the vantage points of multilateral development banks, national policymakers, and capital market strategists. This session, Empower Inclusive Growth Through Innovative Financing, is firmly anchored in the overarching theme of this year's annual meeting, Connecting for Growth. If connectivity is the backbone of development, then financing is its lifeblood. But not all financing is equal, and not all growth is inclusive. Our discussion today seeks to examine some of the new tools, partnerships, and financial innovations that can unlock opportunities for those most in need, bridging not just infrastructure gaps, but inclusion gaps. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists. Let me first welcome to the panel Dr. Ahmed Galal, former Finance Minister of Egypt. Mr. Galal chairs the boards of trustees for the Middle East and North Africa Health Policy Forum and the Egyptian Foundation for Integrated Development. He is also a member of the UN Committee for Development Policy. Mr. Galal was Managing Director of the Economic Research Forum and, as said, Minister of Finance of Egypt from 13 to 14 years. Prior to that, he spent 18 years at the World Bank, where he conducted research and provided policy advice for governments. Welcome, Mr. Galal. Let me also welcome Mr. Guan Zheng as Acting Vice President for Policy and Strategy at the AIIB. She's in charge of the strategic agenda, overseeing AIIB's environmental, social, and procurement policies and their implementation. She manages the bank administrative budget. She's also in charge of the bank operational partnerships, including institutional engagement, concessional resource mobilization, and special fund management. Thank you very much for joining us today. We will also like to welcome Mrs. Amakobe Sande, who is UNICEF's Country Program Manager in China. She provides strategic direction to deliver impactful results for children. With over 30 years of experience in international development, humanitarian coordination, policy analysis, advocacy, resource mobilization, partnership, she brings a wealth of experience to her role. Thank you for having us today. Thank you for joining us today. Finally, let me introduce Miao Yanling as Chief Strategist and Managing Director at China International Capital Corporation Limited, a role he assumed in March 2023. Widely regarded as one of China's most influential macro analysts, he brings deep expertise in global economy policy and financial markets. Welcome, sir. Well, is working properly? Let me just to give here a context on how we're going to proceed. We're going to have 3 rounds of questions, and then we really are encouraging participation from the room. So questions, even if during those rounds of questions you want to ask anything further or any follow-up questions, I will be very liberal on the management of this session, and I really want it to be an interactive one, so please feel free from the room to engage with both me and our guests today at any moment in time. There's microphones around. Just raise your hand and I will be giving you the floor. So let's begin with framing this round to understand how each one of you defines the opportunities ahead. You all come from very different backgrounds, and actually that's what makes this panel so rich. And so I really would like to start by asking you, Dr. Ahmed, as a former finance minister and a thought leader on economic policy, what is your perspective on the importance of infrastructure for inclusive economic growth? And what would you consider to be the best way to secure the financial resources to implement them? Sir.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Pedro, and thank you all for coming. I don't read from anything written, so you will forgive me and it's afternoon and I'm jet lagged, so God knows how things will come out. So cope with me. Now, your question has two sides to it, actually. The first part of it is an easy one, and in fact, everybody in this room knows the answer, but I will still elaborate a little bit. The second part, I think I have something probably interesting to say. Now, what's the first part? The first part has to do with in which way infrastructure is important for inclusive economic growth. Infrastructure is an ingredient for economic growth in several ways. One, it's one possibility of crowding out other investment and other activities to begin with. It's a way of enhancing productivity. It's a way of attracting FDI. It's a way of reducing transaction cost and making it easier for business to conduct its own business. So from a growth perspective, in fact, you really cannot go very far without having enough roads and water and electricity and bridges and ports and so on. So it is too obvious to even state what I'm saying, but for the heck of completeness, let's put it that way. The more tricky part has to do with in which way the infrastructure is important for inclusion. The obvious statement is that if infrastructure is boosting economic growth, we know that economic growth has this wonderful effect. As the level of water rises, there is more and everybody goes up a little bit. Poverty is reduced. I think the best example the world has seen, as far as I am concerned, and I'm a student of economics and history, is China. China has been able, through its impressive economic growth track record, to lift so many millions and millions and millions, I don't remember the exact number, I'm sure my colleague here would know the exact number, out of poverty. So growth has immediate implications on inclusion through its capacity to reduce poverty. So that's one channel. The other channel, possible channel, is that when you grow, you have resources. When you have resources, you can spend them, allocate them to some activities that are what I would call enhance equality of opportunity. If you spend some of the money that you get out of economic growth on education and health and roads and infrastructure and sanitation and this and that, you're actually enabling people to go through what one might call the upward social mobility. So you get people moving from one level to another. At any rate, I don't want to elaborate that point too much, honestly, because I do know very well that you know about it as much as I do, if not better. Now let me move on to the second part, which has to do with in financial innovations and in which way financial innovations can serve the whole objective of inclusive economic growth. And I have a confession to make. I know nothing about it. The people who really know about these alternative financial mechanisms are sitting on my left. He also knows because he's running a financial business and he knows exactly how to make money. So if you want to if you want to know how to do it, this guy knows quite a bit. So if that is the case, and I admit that I don't really know a lot about alternative financial mechanisms, in which way I have something to say, I come to that story from a very different perspective. I'm not going to be telling you about blend finance, green bonds, local currency bonds, and this and that, and in which way one of them is superior to the other. That I leave it to the experts, and they are on my right and on my left. However, I come to it from the point of view of a developing country that is seeking to get finance to achieve its own objectives. It's a broader perspective. And I have something to say from that particular angle. The good news is that the availability of finance in general would enable countries to, to do things they wouldn't be able to do otherwise. The question really, the real question for this panel, and for me and for you and for everybody else is, as was pointed out, is that not all alternative financing mechanisms are equal in terms of their impact on the objective of inclusive economic growth. And from my perspective, also from the broader perspective, I have some concerns. I want to challenge my colleagues to try to take them into account when they tell us about these alternative mechanisms. And let me state them one after the other. First one is what I call a moral hazard problem. What is the story? When money comes from outside, who is getting it? If it is a government, I am afraid that sometimes some countries, governments in some developing countries, may have an appetite. Now I have more money. I was going to spend the little money I have on building a power plant, but now our moderator gave me some of his money, and now I'm richer, so I can build a palace. So in fact, sometimes having additional resources may in fact increase the appetite of governments to spend on what I would call unworthy social projects. So that's a concern. I need to worry about it. It's not something I take for granted. Now, what about if the borrower within the developing country is a state-owned corporation? It's fantastic news. If I am the one who is running an SOE, and I am going to borrow money from him, since he has a lot of money, am I going to carry the risk? Not really. The government is going to give me a guarantee. There is the risk that I also would want to borrow money as much as I like, because somebody else is going to bail me out whenever things go sour. In a way, there is a moral hazard problem in making additional funds available, and it is the responsibility of those who are giving the money to make sure, if it's a AIIB, I keep trying to remember that thing. It's not easy, and you cannot abbreviate it. It's not like CBC, AIIB. Anyway, at the end, I need to worry about whether money is really not allowing others to misbehave. Am I taking too much money? Too much?
No, not money.
I'm taking too much money.
Money for sure. You might make you take a little of time, but please.
Okay. Now I have a couple of other points to make. The second point is second challenge that I am giving also to you and me and them and everybody else is this divergence between the private rate of return and the social rate of return. So the first problem is the moral hazard problem, the way I explained it. Second one is the divergence between the private sector is in the business of maximizing profit, period. If we are interested in inclusive economic growth, we are interested in the social rate of return, not just in the private return on money. And if there is a wedge between both, there is a real challenge. Who is going to, fill in that gap? Is it the government? Is it the donors? Is it who exactly is? So I cannot assume that socially desirable projects will always find someone who is willing to fund them, because the inequality between the two rates of return. My final challenge to my colleagues has to do with something that has to do with the infrastructure as a business in general. And that's, in economics, we have that field called industrial organization and network industries. Network industries, by technology, they create natural monopolies. They tend to generate revenues in local currencies, whereas the revenues are in local currencies, whereas they are capital intensive, they require a lot of debts in foreign exchange. Imagine a water company or electricity company selling to local people. Well, they're getting their money in local currency, but their borrowing for the capital investment was in dollars. The currency mismatch. So there is a currency mismatch problem. There is an exchange rate problem. Therefore, infrastructure, by definition, any financial solutions that are likely to work will have to address upfront these two challenges. I don't know whether these challenges are enough, but I think I want to stop here and allow our moderator to push us around. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed. Let me just clarify that both neither the moderator nor do I think the AIIB will be financing any palaces soon, so we'll be strict on that. But actually turning to the AIIB and asking you, Madam Zeng, from the AIIB strategic perspective, how does the bank define inclusiveness in infrastructuring finance? What are the innovations, what innovations are providing most relevant across your diverse membership?
Thank you very much. That's a very good question. So first, I would say sustainability and inclusive is really a part of AIIB's DNA. Our mission is to finance infrastructure for tomorrow to support sustainable growth. So sustainability and inclusiveness is actually one of the three requirements that are set out in the strategy, but also very much embedded in our operational policies. So let me explain. One, in corporate strategy. So our board just approved unanimously our updated corporate strategy out of the midterm review of the corporate strategy. So in the corporate strategy, which we already posted on website, you will find that as a very earlier part, we explicitly stress the requirement of sustainability in all of our financing. So we have three aspects of sustainability. So first one is any project that we finance must be economically and financially sustainable. Secondly, environmentally sustainable. Thirdly, socially sustainable and inclusiveness. How we do that? First, in our environmental social framework and in our environmental social policy, we make it a requirement that no harm should be induced because our financing in any project. So that is sort of the requirement of doing no harm at all as a policy requirement. And that is a bottom line. I think as a multilateral development bank, we also have an important development mission and a development mandate that require us as a development bank to support the client to achieve additional. So we need to add value to our client in the project that's owned by our client but financed by us. So in that regard, we're also required by our operational policy for financing to support our client to achieve their development outcome. So part of the development outcome, which is very important, is to support a client to achieve socially sustainability, inclusiveness, address the needs of vulnerable people, and address the needs of underserved population. So I would say that's deeply embedded in our policies and strategies. So in many cases, we found it's not the case that the client does not have the intention to achieve social sustainability. I think all countries are signing up to SDGs. But I think what's lack of is know-how. So we have the mandate and we have responsibility to support our client to achieve. That's why in AIIB and recently, last year, we also came up with Gender Action Plan, which is action plan of the AIIB itself to guide our staff, to support our clients, to achieve gender equality and also inclusiveness. So we are very much committed to work with our clients and to jointly achieve that common objective. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to give now the floor to Mrs. Sandel. UNICEF is at the forefront of human development, particularly working with vulnerable children and families. From your perspective, what does innovative financing for inclusive growth mean in relation to children, young people, and future generations? How can we ensure financial innovation does not leave the youngest members of society behind?
Thank you very much for that question, and let me say how honored I am as UNICEF to be with this illustrious panel, some of whom are our partners already in this area. The case has already been made in the opening ceremony, and you've heard this in different places, that there is a 4 trillion gap annually in meeting the SDGs. 4 million gap annually. For children, young people, what does this translate to? We have about 140 billion gap just for water and sanitation services. We have a $100 billion gap for education. Think about how you compromise future opportunities when investments in education are woefully short. We have 1 billion children, half of the world's children, impacted by climate change, with impacts on their health, on their nutrition, on interruption to services where there have been floods or droughts, schools, hospitals being destroyed. That needs to be paid attention to. These are not just numbers. We are talking about lost potential. We are talking about missed opportunities, and we are talking about a future that is slipping away. So essentially, when UNICEF put up its global strategy for innovative financing for children, we are saying traditional forms of aid, traditional forms of development financing are not going to cut it. We need to fundamentally reform capital flows, financial flows, so that we are generating additional funds at scale for children. And what this means, essentially, is working with international financing institutions, as we do at UNICEF, with regional banks, other public financing facilities, to look at how we can have blended financing between private and public institutions, to look at impact financing, and to essentially say, with existing forms or new forms of financial instruments, tools, and partnerships, how can we be looking at this from a children and young people's lens, and providing the capability and expertise, as well as partnerships, to these institutions so that we can be doing more through those existing or new platforms to impact children. And we are doing this across, I'm not just talking, we are doing this across the ecosystem of partnerships with the World Bank, with the IMF, with the African Development Bank, with Exim Bank. We just signed a groundbreaking partnership this year for Nigeria and water and sanitation facilities. So it's really saying we can generate additional impact for children and young people if we review existing forms of financing and the partnerships that are involved in this, bringing both the public and private sectors to accelerate progress for children and young people. Africa, for example, has a median age of 19. When you're thinking of investing, you're thinking of an ecosystem that will be transformed with a 19-year-old in mind. How often do we actually factor that kind of perspective, that child lens or youth lens, into ensuring that these huge infrastructure projects achieve more than they could and include vulnerable parts of our society, children, but also children in disadvantaged places, and do more, and are therefore sustainable and inclusive for societies. That's what we mean in UNICEF when we talk about innovative financing.
Thank you so much. I was recently looking at some numbers. When you look at K-12 education, for example, Europe, North America, even China have reached their peak of students of K-12. In Africa, you probably have 2-3 million schools that need to be built in the next 2 decades. How do you see, and I'm going to follow up on with you now right away, how do you really see some of these solutions coming for the financing of sectors which were not always looked at for profit? And so how, in a practical terms, how is UNICEF addressing this education need, for example, in Africa, just to point out something very concrete that you mentioned?
Yes, and let me build on your example and say, yes, indeed, there is a difference. In those countries, the upper middle income and high income countries, while the investments have been established in basic education, the challenge now is with the transition from education to employment, or education to entrepreneurship. And so, for example, with the World Bank, we have secured the aligning of $1 billion to exactly address this issue through an initiative that we call Generation Unlimited. And it's about skilling young people for the jobs of the future, or skilling young people for entrepreneurship. That's just one practical example. In places, again, which I would say are upper or high middle income places, Moldova, looking at the social protection system of that country, working with the Ministry of Finance to be able to give a cash grant to vulnerable populations, children 0 to 18 years of age, who receive 35 or more if they are facing additional vulnerabilities like disability, for instance, and just reforming completely what the social protection network in a country like that has advanced but has perhaps left people behind. In Nigeria, where water and sanitation is critical, even in the context of education, we've secured an agreement with the Ministry of Finance of Nigeria and with Exim Bank in China to invest in water and sanitation facilities in the Federal Capital Territory of Abuja across tens of schools, markets, hospitals, and connecting an ecosystem that was previously around just an infrastructure project to ensure there was additional value in that ecosystem for children and young people, and therefore making that project much more attractive because of its inclusivity, social cohesion, but also looking at sustainability into the future. So we do have these many, many examples of partnerships that we have developed that go beyond the orthodoxy of just aid. That's not going to be enough, particularly now, as you heard in the opening remarks, in an environment of massively declining ODA. We've got to look at other transformational partnerships and fundamentally reforming capital markets, financial flows, so that they have this extra benefit for sustainability into the future.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Dr. Miao Yanling, I'd like to bring you now onto the debate. As a macro strategist and economist, how would you define inclusive growth in the context of the capital markets and global financial flows? Which financial innovations do you consider to be the most promising in terms of narrowing this gap of inclusion? Please.
Well, thank you, Pedro. I'm very glad to be on this distinguished panel. The two important things Pedro mentioned, one is inclusive growth, the other is capital flows. To me, they are, integral part to each other. I want to begin by giving you a set of numbers. So the living standard in rich country today is, in terms of purchasing power parity adjusted, it's 71,000 US dollars. Guess how much is in emerging and developing countries? Only 17,000 US dollars. The gap is 53,000 US dollars. The problem is that gap actually is going to increase. It's already increased a lot compared to 15 years ago. The gap was a mere, it's a large gap. It's like 33,000. But from 33,000 US dollar gap, now it's like a 53,000 US dollar gap. The bad news is 5 years from now, by the IMF estimate, that gap will keep growing to what? To 63,000 US dollars. So that's the gap we're talking about. That's the growth gap. That's the convergence gap. The rich country gets richer. The poor country or developing country is not catching up. So what's behind this inclusion gap or, convergence gap? To me, I think finance played an important role. Global capital flows, they still flow up here. They don't flow down here. Global capital is still, from capital-rich country, which is the developed country, or the advanced country, towards emerging markets. It should be the other way around, where if your capital scarce, by theory, you should generate a higher return. And then capital should from global north to global south. But what do we see, for the past several decades, what do we see is always capital flows the other way around. In the economics jargon, that's called Lucas puzzle or Lucas paradox. Capital flow from rich country to poor country. Capital flow from poor country to rich country. There should be the other way around. So how do we change that? How do we change the financing gap so that we can change the convergence gap? I think, we need to do innovations. There are a few innovations in my mind. I think, if capital from north to south is not possible, we need to be innovative here. We need to think about ways that capital can from global south to other south countries. There are, south countries like China. We are actually net capital exporting countries. So in this area, I can think of 3 new models of financing. That's including, new entities or new ways of financing, new instruments of financing, and then new institutions of financing. So begin with the new institutional financing. This very institution, AIIB, which we are celebrating its 10th birthday, I think is a very good case in point that with this institution, you can have a global south to global south financing. That's very important. And then in terms of new models of financing, I think this session is hosted by Exim Bank. I have heard of that, Exim Bank and then AIIB and then many other, national development banks. They can cooperate with each other to have a blended model of financing. That probably can also include the private sector as well. Lastly, but not least, in terms of new instrument financing, we have, minister from Egypt. If I remember correctly, I think last year we had an example of AIIB using credit enhancement mechanism that help member countries, issue bond. Not only that, I think, going forward, we're going to see a lot of global trade increasingly relying on financing. Traditionally, this financing is provided by US dollar. Now, dollar is in high interest rate. Other currency, including Chinese currency, renminbi is low interest rate. I think Exim Bank and other development bank or Exim Bank, commercial bank, they can help provide financing in terms of local currency or trade financing, supply financing. So in short, I see the biggest challenge to inclusive growth is from this convergence gap, is from the financing gap. How do we bridge this financing gap? I think we need new ways of, new models of financing. AIIB, Exim Bank, or the new instrument, they all play a role here. Thank you.
Thank you. And I actually want to continue the conversation with you exactly to push a little further on what you were saying. We kind of defined what are we going to be talking today. Now let's talk about delivery. inclusive growth required smart financing as well as good ideas, right? We want now to explore, and you mentioned that in your intervention, how to mobilize private capital, because private capital will have a profit-seeking approach, and
yes.
as we heard from Dr. Galal, not always will we have an alignment of interests between the private capital and other sources of capital. So from this capital market perspective, how would you describe the role of sustainable finances, such as ESG instruments or SDG-linked bonds, in aligning investors' incentives with inclusive development outcomes? Are investors generally demanding inclusion, or does it more of a policy intervention needs to be made? So also, how do you really match this profit seeking, which is legitimate and has to be at the source of financing, because at the end, if it's not there, well then institutions like the AIIB and many others can get into trouble if they do not keep this profit or this sustainable approach, if we don't want to use the word profitable. How do you see this work, and how do you really think that investors are actually really concerned about it?
Okay. This is a great question. You know, I go to international conferences a lot. I used to, I was a chief economist at SAFE. I go to many different conferences. You know, when people start talking about ESG, usually you lose like half of the crowd.
Hopefully not today.
Not today, yes. Because, the half of the crowd is people are looking for profit. So, but I think, these two are not in conflict. Companies can both do good and do well. I want to give you several concrete examples, but not every example. For example, there are areas such as poverty alleviation, basic education, healthcare, and the rural infrastructure. In those cases, I think it's very hard to make money, but it has a huge positive externality. That's where government intervention is needed. That's where, development bank is needed. But we also have other areas. I think, doing good is also will make you doing well. For example, in the green energy transition, in the new electrical vehicles area, why that is different? I think that's different because the two forces combine with each other. One force is green transition. The other force is digital transition. And if you combine both, you have economy of scale. So I'll give you a concrete example. The solar power used to be very expensive. Now we have breached this, levelized cost. The solar power cost now is like 20 cents, Chinese cents per kilowatt hour. It's now below coal-generated power. And then if you have this economy of scale, if you have a large market, because of this new energy, they are more manufacturing oriented. It's not like the old one, like old energy. You have to dig, you have to, rely on natural resources. This is the more manufacturing, more economy of scale. So if you invest in those areas, I do think, you can make money. But then the question is, maybe in the initial stage, you still need some policy nudge, saying, maybe, to have green transition because of the positive externality. Some people say this is subsidy. I think, subsidy carry a stigma with it. Not all subsidies are bad. If you have a positive externality that if no government subsidy is provided, this product won't be provided by the market. So maybe in the very beginning, in the early stage, you provide some subsidy, but then you gradually phasing out. So nowadays in China, you don't have subsidy for new electrical vehicles, but still, you have very fierce market competition, and the leading companies, say BYD or CATL, they're making good profit. So they are these new energy companies. Their return on equity is like 20%, 30%, much higher than average return to equity, which is around 5% in traditional car industries. So I give you some of the examples that doing well does not necessarily mean, that doing good does not necessarily mean doing badly. It actually can make you doing well. But you need to find the niche market that combines the economy of scale and the economy of transition.
And that was exactly the big transition that we had on green, for example, was how and when it turned profitable, right? And so the moment that the solar energy became profitable, you saw how the private capital deployed at a very fast speed.
Yeah.
But at the beginning, when it started, you had almost zero private capital coming into this sector. Thank you very much for insights. We always talk about the success cases. Let me bring you, Dr. Gal, onto the conversation again on also some of the cases where it did not work. So some of these alternative financing infrastructure projects were just as you said, not building palaces, but sometimes were really cases that did not work, and sometimes cases that worked very well. And maybe from your own experience in Egypt and Africa, maybe you can share some of those examples with us here today.
Well, thank you, Pedro. I will continue with the same hat on, meaning from the countries, developing countries' perspective, from a policymaker's perspective. I know a few basic things. I know that I want to develop infrastructure because it's good for inclusive growth, as has been advertised. I know I don't have the resources because my saving rates are relatively modest compared to my needs. So I need additional resources. I would like AIIB to give me money for free, but they don't. So I probably have to go to the private sector. And the private sector is very demanding. They want a very high return on the thing. And I ask myself, how do I do it? How do I get the financing on my terms such that I succeed in delivering what I want to deliver the best way possible? And here is where I come up with two examples, one success and one failure, in my view, or not less successful, let's put it that way, so that we don't displease anyone. And I'm going to end up by contrasting the two to make a broader point that, again, not all ways to achieve your objectives are equally valid or equally good or equally efficient, right? So, to the examples. My best examples that I can come up with to illustrate my broader point is Chile. And I will contrast the Chilean case with the Egyptian case. I come from Egypt, by the way. So I guess you can always criticize yourself easier than criticizing somebody else, right? Anyway, in the case of Chile, in the 80s, they decided their vehicle, their way of attracting capital, private, domestic, or foreign, into infrastructure was by doing the following. Coming up with the rules of the game, defining them, the rules about pricing of the services, electricity or whatever, rules about entry of new firms, rules about the operation of firms within a given sector, rules about resolving conflicts, rules about rates of return that the government would guarantee, a fair rate of return, they call it. And then they created an independent regulatory body, empowered by law to oversee the implementation of these rules. Guess what? The clarity of the rules, the credibility of the promises attracted a lot of capital. Chile was able to generate a lot of investors into electricity sector and other similar infrastructure sectors simply by setting up the scene, setting the rules of the game, and inviting everybody to come and operate on equal footings. No differentiation between those who come first or those who come later. It worked extremely well. Electricity was available, produced efficiently, people were not complaining. There is always room for monopolistic behavior in these infrastructure activities, but the rules and implementation of that rules and striking a balance between the interest of the producer and the consumer ensure that nobody is complaining. So that's my first story. Now let's contrast that with the Egyptian case. I think we try to do everything in one. We tried to have it both ways. We had two approaches in operation. One of them is what is referred to as PPP, public-private partnership. It's a transaction-based approach. Every day I wake up, I need an additional power plant. I invite people to come. I negotiate with them the terms of the operation of that particular power plant. Of course, circumstances change. People come over time. Every time I am doing one of those, I have different terms. So there is something that the trouble with these contracts is that, as they say, contracts are imperfect by definition. Why? Because every time you write a contract, you cannot anticipate all eventualities in the future. Therefore, there is always a problem. And there is always a dispute, and there is always arbitration internationally, and it's a very costly proposition. So this transaction-based public-private partnership approach, it turned out that it really doesn't work. When I was in the Ministry of Finance in Egypt, we had a unit called PPP, and it was trying to relieve the pressure on the budget by getting the private sector to fund public projects that we want to have, and we use that approach. And when I asked my friends and my colleagues in that unit, how many did you succeed to do? He says, I said an X number. I mean, what's the percentage of the ones that have been completed? It was relatively low. How many are in court? Too many. I wanted to close the shop, but in any case, that's a different story. I just want to make the point that this transaction-based, piece by piece, transaction by transaction, is something that proved not to be working very well. I said that Egypt followed two tracks. One of them was this transaction-based approach, and at the same time, they also created a policy and regulatory environment for operating in these infrastructure activities. The trouble is, the regulatory agency that's supposed to be enforcing the rules was not independent. It is actually a regulatory agency that's headed by the minister, let's say, of energy, who also heads the production and provision of the companies that are producing electricity. So you're getting the judge and the lawyer to be one. You cannot do that. It doesn't work. So in my, anyway, I mean, I can talk about that for a long period of time. My suggestion is the following. My suggestion is, out of that experience, if I were to be telling a policymaker or advising a policymaker in a developing country to provide the infrastructure the most efficient way, try to set up the rules of the game and the policy framework, then invite the providers to come in on equal terms, competitively. That is your best way of making progress. Don't do it the Egyptian way. Thank you.
Thank you. Coming from an Egyptian, don't do it the Egyptian way, but we clearly got the point on how to actually make sure that some of the involvement of multilateral organizations can actually bring the right framework and setting what the private sector will not do, right? You will not have an investor in the private sector coming to a country and saying you need to reform your energy market before we invest. That never happens from the private sector. But AIIB and other multilaterals have that capacity to actually provide the assistance and force in a good way some of those reforms. So I would like to hear you on that, but I also want to focus a little bit more on AIIB, who has piloted the blended finance and thematic bonds, which are also a very important way to allow for financing to come to some of these projects. Can you please share some examples of where the AIIB has succeeded in attracting both this private capital but also other sources of capital towards socially inclusive outcomes, and what institutional safeguards are essential for replicating such deals, and namely exactly what I was talking about, how do the reforms and how can you actually help some of the countries where you operate do those reforms, something that the private sector cannot do?
Thank you very much. So in AIIB, in its first 10 years, we actually have been quite innovative in terms of mobilizing resources, various resources, to support sustainable and inclusive development. There are different elements in different projects. So some projects are more towards mobilizing private capital, and some of others more towards mobilizing grants, or some of them are sort of innovative in terms of financing instrument itself. But I obviously, going to the next decade, we need to do more. But since here we are in China, so I just want to cite one example of those innovative approach, where we finance Tajikistan Albigam Nurabad Road project. And we have successfully cooperated with China International Development Cooperation Agency and mobilize their grants to finance a package of gender inclusiveness intervention. So this package actually includes 3 components. Establish community training center for women. And secondly, provide a tailored women's entrepreneurship program to enhance local livelihoods. And the third component is train technical and vocational infrastructure workers. So the project institutionalizes a women's economic empowerment component in a climate-resilient transport project. And at the same time, we partner with national ministries, CSOs, and MDB's partners. So in this project, we co-finance together with AIIB and EBRD. This project exemplifies how grant capital can de-risk social intervention, build capacity, and create the enabling environment to eventually crowd in private sector, private actors for entrepreneurship support, vocational placement, and service delivery. So I think the experience that we have from this project and example is, first, as a general point, AIIB has been quite flexible in its policy while upholding high standard. When I say flexible is that when we just start, we recognize we need time to build our capacity. But we also recognize the important role of mobilizing private capital and the important role of MDB working as a system in a country. So we make our policy quite open in accepting application of our peer MDB's policy, which make it much easier for us to work with peer MDBs and jointly support our client country. Instead, I would just come to the country and say, this is AIIB way, we just work on our own, right? And we have our own solution. We can't. I don't think any financing institution could work alone and to provide a solution. So that's the first point. And second point is, when you think about how to serve the client, you really need to think about then what is the most needed by your client, public and private sector. So in our case, because we're new and we don't want to set up many trust funds, no, we don't have, right? It takes time. So then we created this project level special fund window. That is to say, at the project level, in the project context, we mobilize grants. So this is a little bit similar as like Minister Gala just said, transaction by transaction. You know, at the project level, we already identified some donors, and they have grants ready. So we created this project special fund window to bring in additional grants and to support inclusiveness package. I think that's quite innovative. And one of the experiences also, don't think anything that would start from some grand framework or policy, but take step by step and look at this specific project context and be innovative. Thank you.
And those grants, I want to follow up with you on that. Yes. Those grants actually end up being a good incentive for some of those reforms and some of those projects to happen. In Central Asia, for example, you've mentioned Tajikistan there. AIIB, EBRD have been really pushing for a number of reforms. So how would you see those reforms enabling these new types of financing? So and this work with the countries where you operate, how do you see those grants also becoming almost the final incentive to get some of those changes happening?
So in AIIB, we actually embed the use of any grants or concessional resource into our regular financing. So that's a way of doing that. Because in our regular financing, we are bounded by our operational policies, and we are required by our corporate strategy in terms of thematic priority, in terms of sustainability. So whenever we use grants or concessional financing, they are to provide capacity building support. They are to provide a technical assistance to make sure the projects that we will finance will be ready, and they become bankable. So in that regard, you actually align the use of resource objective vis-a-vis the objective of our financing, which is always sustainability, right? So that is the way of you blend the various kind of resources and align the objective all together so that you could incentivize your client or sponsor of the project to do the same thing as you want to do, and also as the donor wants to do. Thank you.
Thank you. And UNICEF also works with the governments and partners to develop some of these projects, whether it is to develop gender-responsive budgeting, child-focused financing, and impact-linked investments. And continue on this line of incentives and creating the right mood. Could you share examples on how financing innovation has improved service delivery or access for disadvantaged children and young people?
Okay, so I spoke to that earlier already, but I've given the examples of partnerships with World Bank.
Yes.
On nutrition, on education, on health projects. I spoke also about beyond working with children, how we are interested to also address innovative financing platforms that address this whole school to work transition, school to entrepreneurship transition. So we do have examples of social impact bonds, child bonds, parametric insurance schemes, youth impact funds, going into the area of green and resilient social services for children, solarization, for instance, of essential services for children, whether it's solarization of schools, hospitals, and water and sanitation systems, for examples. And these are all done through engagements, firstly with ministries of finance, engagements with sector ministries in health, in education, and in water, where we are looking together at prioritizing how resources are allocated and whether they are allocated effectively, but also looking again, as I said earlier, at how big infrastructure projects can have this additional benefits for children. In the context you are talking about ESG, and ESG losing half the room when you're speaking in big conferences. But we operate in that space as well in terms of child rights and business principles. In ESG, we've signed here in China, there are many examples globally, an MOU with the China-Africa Business Council, which is a platform of 3,300 Chinese companies working in Africa. Again, exactly to look at those investments, not just from a corporate social responsibility feel-good factor, but really about driving the core of their investments so that they can be more beneficial and more socially inclusive, and therefore more sustainable. Because it's okay to make profit. Nobody argues with that, but I really like the point he was making, that you can do good and do well. You can make profit, but how are you doing it? And doing it so that it's not a one-hit wonder, but you're doing it in ways that are sustained into the future. So yes, she also talked about de-risking. We are also actively involved in de-risking, project support, getting our technical experts to go in right from the beginning to look at how projects can be adjusted to have this broader social impact perspective. And through that de-risking, you then crowd in or bring in additional private capital as well, because then there is an interest that this is going in the right direction. But I did want to say it's more than just about money and bringing in the money that is so badly needed for these investments. It's really about looking at securing investments into the future and not compromising future generations. Thank you.
Thank you. And you already took us to the future in a very good way. And I want to continue with Dr. Miao. As the global markets evolve, which technologies or structure, is it digital finance, is it AI and credit, is it local currency solutions, are you watching most closely, who have the potential to transform inclusion?
Yeah, I mean, the three areas you mentioned, I watched them closely, but today I want to focus on one, which is local currency solutions. You know, in the economics literature, this is also called original sin. For many developing countries, they cannot issue bond or borrow in their own currency, and then hence the subject to, you know, currency mismatch, subject to global financial cycle. Because if they borrow in dollar, and then dollar is the global currency, but the Federal Reserve is not a global central bank, then they're going to face a problem. It's not coordinated. And then also, it's not a very balanced system, right? Because the dollar is only, what, 10% of a global trade, 15% of global GDP, PPP adjusted. But, you know, dollar financing is 60% of global financing. Dollar, you know, denomination is 80% of global denomination. So here I see both imbalance, uncoordinated, but also inadequate in terms of global financial safety net. So if you have a local currency financing, I think that's going to go a long way in alleviate the imbalance, uncoordination, and inadequacy problem I mentioned earlier. How? I mean, for example, I think in the past it's going to be difficult, but now I think, you know, with euro, with renminbi, you know, I mean, a lot of European countries are members of this bank as well. I think it's a huge potential to borrow in, you know, in those currencies. For renminbi, I make a few points. For the past decade, you know, to borrow in renminbi, always face two headwinds, but these two headwinds are now fully reversed. The number one headwind is really, renminbi used to be the high interest rate currency, so it's costly to borrow in renminbi. Now it's the other way around. Renminbi is the cheap currency, it's low interest rate, right? Our policy rate is 1.4%, our 10-year bond is 1.6%. You know, US policy rate is 4.3%, 10-year bond is 4.5%. So now that headwind has been reversed. The other headwind is, you know, whenever you have global uncertainty, you would think dollar is going to hold its value. And the renminbi, especially if you're going to have a trade war or trade frictions, renminbi is facing some depreciation pressure. Now it's the other way around. I mean, recent example has shown that, you know, a dollar can no longer hold its value during global turmoil. But also, you know, shows that, you know, in this trade war second version, dollar depreciated, yet renminbi actually appreciated. I think this is going to be, you know, if you take a longer term view, I mean, many of you live in China, you know how much purchasing power your renminbi has, right? I mean, so much more affordable everything in China than compared to the rest of the world. So renminbi is not a weak currency. So traditionally, people don't want to borrow or lend in renminbi because, or in a local currency, because they think the local currency is going to lose its value, right? If you know, 20 years ago, I started working in the IMF as a young economist. I go to many emerging markets. I was told nobody's going to lend in their own currency because they're worried about inflation, worried about the currency volatility. Now I think it's the two headwinds no longer there. Renminbi is, you know, low interest rate, cheap to borrow, but it's also more importantly, you know, it's very stable. Yeah, it holds its value. So I think that's going to be a huge change. On top of that, I think it's important that we have some infrastructure or institutional arrangement to support the liquidity. I'm glad to see the expanding swap lines. The PBOC, where I used to work, now signed around 40 currency swap lines with global central banks, providing 4.5 trillion renminbi. So this will make cross-border renminbi much more liquid and much more accessible. So I do think we are at a crossroad in terms of the international monetary system. Many currencies, the fund is the opportunity. I think certainly this holds true for renminbi as well. I think this local currency solution is going to be, a big area that both international development banks or Exim banks need to explore. Thank you.
Thank you. You raised really, really interesting topics there for discussion that could take us the whole afternoon for discussions on the monetary policy of the different countries. But you made some great points there. I want to have two more questions focused more on AIIB, and so with the two people directly involved with AIIB here, before I open to the room for questions. I will start, Dr. Galal. You have now an advisory role as member of the International Advisory Panel of the AIIB. What policy or institutional changes do you believe are most needed to enable the bank to contribute to the inclusive development agenda of its member countries? So now let's focus on the AIIB and then get the room to prepare questions so that we have time to...
How many hours do you have?
Well, I have 3 minutes for you now. I'm going to try to be more disciplined now.
No, I actually am going to be very brief because that's really an important topic and it's really up to AIIB to figure it out. The guy is coming from outside can, just say some things. Hopefully, some of them management may find it useful. So that's pretty much the entry point for me. I think the challenge for ERF now, for AIIB, is that they were successful. The trouble with success is that you have to outperform yourself. It's like you run a marathon and you really achieve a score that's really hard to achieve. Well, tell me, what are you going to do next? In a way, success is a challenge in its own right. Second, I think everybody, what you have heard over the last couple of days is that there is consensus that ERF has really lived up to expectations and, in fact, surpassed expectations. I have to admit that my view of institutions is that they are like turtles. They move very slowly. They grow very slowly. They also die very slowly. AIIB was not a turtle. It was a jumping turtle. It didn't move like this. It jumped like this one. So I think there is a real challenge. The challenge is how to outperform yourself. And adding to that is the fact that the world, as has been indicated as well, the world is characterized nowadays by major shifts in orientation, as a matter of fact. This whole idea of the collapse of multilateralism is a real challenge. It's almost like a new world other than the one we have been used to and have been thinking about for quite some time. So we really have to go soul searching and figuring out how are we going to regroup. One of the interesting concepts that I've heard the other day is called N-1, global economic order. And you know who is the one. But in any case, I'm not going to elaborate on world economic order. That's not AIIB. AIIB is doing really well. I mean, if I were to give one single advice, honestly, derived from what I have just said, it is this idea of you want to maximize the benefits from your involvement with developing countries in enhancing issues of inclusive growth. I really want you to think about the environment in which you are thinking about your projects. Transactions in their own right, I'm sorry, yes, they are easy, they are narrow, they are confined. You can touch them, you see the results. All that is acceptable and is quite sensible. And in fact, in many instances, the most you can do is just a transaction. But I am suggesting that it's a way of thinking about the world. And I think your impact, developmental impact, will be much harder if you make sure that in as many instances as possible, you are worried about the environment in which your transactions are taking place. Thank you.
The future for AIIB, in all the topics that we've discussed, I want to leave the question as wide open for you to conclude this part, and then before we put it to the room, please.
Thank you very much. I very much appreciate, Pedro, you asked the question about advice to AIIB. I very much appreciate advice, indeed, from His Excellency Minister Gala, your advice. I think those are really relevant. So first, I would say, in the world of uncertainty, I mean, today's world is profoundly different from the time when AIIB was set up. And the world of uncertainty and also fragmentation really calls for multilateralism to continue work, to demonstrate that AIIB, as a part of the MDB, we work with other MDB as a system, and to showcase that multilateral cooperation is really a key to bring solution, to continue to foster the cooperation among all the countries, and to promote sustainable growth. So that would be the first point I want to make. And second point, in responding to Minister Gala's advice on this enabling environment, I think this question also came out from your previous question. Yes, we are not just a finance project at transaction level. We do need to have a big picture, and we do need to understand the country's context and support the country to create enabling environment. That's why actually last year we created a new instrument, what we call climate-focused policy-based financing. My previous boss, Danny, he's here, and under his leadership, we jointly created that new instrument. The purpose of that new instrument is really to support the country to create conducive environment and a regulatory framework for country to invest more in climate projects and invest more in climate adaptation projects, but also to create environment to mobilize more private capital. So that's what we're doing. But lastly, I want to say, yes, we are facing challenges. We see, I mean, we are successful in the first 10 years, but I would say we also need to be humble in the next 10 years. We need to learn from our clients, we need to learn from our partners, and we need to do more and be more innovative. We actually see the challenges of our client is also the challenge to ourselves, to be innovative, to support our client, to overcome those challenges. So for that regard, we really very much appreciate all of your advice, your suggestions, and your feedback to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I was last week in Doha meeting the CEO of QIA, the Sovereign Fund of Qatar, and he was telling me about a specific project which is a very good adaptation to this. You are doing the difficult stuff, but the needed stuff. And so sometimes that's exactly what institutions like the AIIB need to do. It's the tough part, the things that others are not doing, but are the right ones. Really now I would like to open the discussion to the room. Questions, comments, things you agree, things you don't agree, things you want to explore more. We have a question here on the first row, please. Can you just introduce yourself before asking the question? Thank you. Nope.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I'm Auvo Kaikkonen. I'm from European Investment Bank. So we share a lot of commonalities with AIIB, our good partner and friends. But the question actually that I want to pose is on the topic of private capital, because I think we all agree that without private capital involvement, we are not going to reach the goals we are after. And I have a specific question to Madame Sande regarding the role of the multilateral international institutions. Do you have anything in your toolbox to kind of help to incentivize the private capital to get involved in projects that prioritize social impact and inclusivity? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please. Go ahead. Thank you very much for your question.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your question. Indeed, we do. And because we are in the social impact space, we are constantly being asked this question. And I can give an example of the UN Capital Development Fund. I don't know whether you've heard of them, I'm sure you have. And a project that we got involved in together in Nigeria for the West Africa region, where we crafted a partnership that provided a loan to a producer of what we call ready-to-use therapeutic foods. You know, the plumpy nut that is used in emergency contexts where the children are malnourished and wasting. And through that arrangement, a private arrangement with a private company incentivizing the company to produce a product that is needed to support child health and nutrition concerns in that environment, but also then guaranteeing, apart from providing the technical expertise around standards, quality, etc., also being at the other end of the spectrum to guarantee market and the buying. So we incentivized a private sector company in that way to be able to benefit, yes, profit, employment, ability to pay the loan, but with a market that was guaranteed to benefit child health and well-being. It's just one example, but we have numerous examples like this.
But let me maybe challenge you back on normally, so that this is really a dialogue. You are the official bank of the European Union and really an institution that grew over the last few years. How is also the EIB bringing some of these private sector into the projects that have this social inclusion? So let me almost put the question back to you so we also get the European perspective on the room, and please others, feel free to join the debate.
Well, thank you, and this was not orchestrated.
No, although I have a EU flag here, but no, it was not.
Yeah, well, I think that we have built in our ESG criteria into all of our projects, and therefore we take that into account, irrespective of who is the borrower of our financing. But at the same time, since we don't do more than 50% of lending into any project, we always require additional or complementary financing to come from some other sources. And private sector is very much incentivized so that we can kind of leverage the benefits of our very attractive financing conditions through the promoter, through blending of some of the grant financing that we get from the European Union, European Commission, so that they can be also indirectly helping the private sector who come into play, so that when they need to raise capital, they can have a longer grace periods, not amortizing immediately, etc., etc. So that makes it more attractive. When there is a social component, you get some brownie points if it's social impact and high in social impact and inclusivity project rated.
Thank you. And let me bring Madam Zeng into this, continuing this line of conversation, because I think it's very interesting. How is AIIB partnering with EIB and others, and how does this element of social impact is part of that discussion on the multilateral? So how is this central to when you are assessing a joint project? Maybe you've done things together in the past. How is that really happening in the real world?
Yeah, it is happening in the real world. So I would say we are very very good partners. We, together with the EIB, actually have financed an increasing number of projects in our joint borrowing members. And what this gentleman just mentioned about the ESG policy requirement, but also policy requirement of we as a MDB, we cannot finance, from AIB's case, we cannot finance more than 35% of our own financing in our non-sovereign backed financing. So by default, you will have to mobilize private capital. So we share the same objective. In many cases, our policy requirements are the same, right? So when we co-financing, we actually can rely each other's work. We come up with a common approach so that our joint client will not be confused because we do have a different way of implement our policy requirements. But we come up with sort of a common list of policy requirements to streamline the process so that the client can easily understand what are the policy requirements, especially when it comes to social inclusiveness requirements. We are very much aligned. We just need to provide one list, but we do our joint work.
Perfect. Thank you very much. More questions and more comments from the room. I don't know if from the client side, maybe we also hear some people who have actually used and put this into practice, or other countries, other regions. Just this question that we had prepared previously. Not really, it's a joke. We haven't. Any more comments? Very well, so then, well, I think we can wrap it up. Thank you very much for joining us today here to the panelists, and thank you for the audience for sticking with us and for giving us all this energy. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the sessions.